Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, do you care if we go through maybe like, I don't want to say like a argument I have because it's not an argument, but maybe like a topic of interest of mine.
Sure. What's up?
So when it comes to like, I think you guys were discussing earlier, like transgender people in sports.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I, from a certain perspective, think that there's no issue whatsoever. You know, from a statistical perspective, there's so few um, occurrences of the opportunity for somebody who, let's say, does have an advantage because they were, you know, a certain gender before,
Like assigned male
you
at
know,
birth.
transition. Exactly. And so, you know, you're probably talking about like 1 in a million odds. So realistically, do there need to be laws surrounding that? No. But also, I do run into the issue of just because it's permissible on a grand scale, does that also mean that we ignore the potential, the, you know, the, see, that's a weird way to phrase it too.
Hmm.
Like the implications that it has on a small scale. So let's say school, you know, 20 people, you know, at least in one grade, in a, you know, on track team. There happens to be one transgender person that does have um, a, you know,
Like, let's say that.
significant advantage,
Yeah.
and there is a scholarship on the line, you know, because for a lot of students that's how they get into college, that's the only way they can afford it, you know. So that's a weird like weird situation that I try to think myself through is, you know, at the end of the day, for the vast majority of people, it's going to make absolutely no difference on their lives. And, you know, like when I say I'm conservative, one of the ways that I mean that is for the most part, I believe that, you know, live and let be, you
Sure.
know, live and let live. I mean, you know, as long as you're not hurting anybody, who cares what happens? Um, and so that's definitely one of those situations where I find myself at a crossroads because like the vast majority of people are never even going to have to think about it in their entire lifetime. But also, does that mean that we ignore the potential implications if somebody does? You know?
Yeah. So I mean, like, there's a couple parts of this, right? So first, the thing about the trans athlete discussion is that, like, I think that the first place to approach it, as far as like an issue to tackle, as far as like answering these questions. Well, the first question that we have to ask is like, are we going to make rules about like trans people categorically, or like smaller people, like parts of the trans community that aren't that doesn't necessarily include everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to approach I just died. And in order to approach that question, then we have to approach the question of, all right, so why would we categorize, like, how would we treat all trans people in a category? You know, or why would we choose to just, like, specially regulate all trans people within a category? And that question gets into, like, all right, well, now we have to look at all, like, to me, this question ultimately becomes a question of, like, okay, do all trans people have an inherent, immutable athletic advantage over cis people, right? Because to me, if the answer to that question is yes, then having some kind of categorical law addressing trans people in sports can become at least more reasonable, right? Because then we're talking about the entire group. But if the answer is no, then we need to be more specific, and we need to start thinking differently in terms of kinds of legislative resolutions. The first thing to address in there, I'm sorry, there's also like a lot of steps in this, right? But basically, if we
Yeah.
want to,
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw so much at you.
no, you're all good. It's like the trans sports is a really complicated issue in this regard, right? Because essentially you have a lot of different kinds of trans people who all have like different varying degrees of athletic advantage or disadvantage in sports, right? So first, like, we have to start with like trans guys or trans men because they're often very left out of the conversation, right? So you have like, so basically most of the time in these conversations, even though like everyone usually will have like a categorical law saying that, like, oh, every person should compete in sports with the consistent with the gender, or sometimes they'll just say like biological sex, consistent with that assigned to you at birth, right? And the problem with that is that, like, when you look at trans guys, all the evidence overwhelmingly shows that they're not going to have any kind of inherent biological advantage over cis guys, right? They're probably going to be on about an even playing field, and at worst, and at worst, like, the risk is that if you enforce the law across the board and you have them compete with cis women, what that means is that they will have an inherent advantage over cis women, right? This was the case with there was a trans guy who competed. I think it was like in Alabama high school. I can't remember particularly, but who competed in high school and was forced because of a transphobic state law to compete in the women's women's state wrestling championship, and he ended up winning. And it's funny because a lot of people who are transphobic ended up like taking a picture of him. I assume it was in like the final round, essentially like pinning a woman. And a lot of people are like, aha, well, this is what happens when you like men into sports. Not realizing that, like, literally as a consequence of a transphobic sports policy, that they had forced a trans guy who was assigned female at birth to compete with other women. And it's like, yes, congratulations, transphobes. You literally have forced a man to compete with women, which seems to be the thing that they were trying to avoid to begin with, if you take them at face value. But the thing is, like, the thing about TERFs, and often TERFs are the people trying to push this, they don't actually like necessarily care so much about that, because to them that person wasn't a man to begin with. They're like biological essentialists. To them that was always a woman. And so like that's very important to recognize here, because that starts explaining a lot of other things, like why they want a categorical ban and not like something more nuanced that may actually be supported by the evidence, you know? So we start with trans guys. All right, trans guys, if you want these kind of laws like categorically to be implemented, then it would mean that necessarily trans men would have an inherent advantage in women's sports. And they literally like the thing that they're advocating for would end up placing men in women's sports. So that's where we start, step one. Step two, trans women, women's sports. Do they have an inherent advantage? Or do they have an inherent immutable athletic advantage over cis women? Well, there's a lot of different variables that can affect that. The first and foremost is the fact that like overwhelmingly evidence shows that like the thing which differentiates whether or not women people have an athletic advantage according to gender. The evidence shows that primarily the thing that's responsible for that is testosterone and the effects that it has on the body, right? And so when you have someone who goes through, like, let's say like a male puberty, again, it's a lot more complicated than that, but we're using shorthand for the sake of time. So someone goes through a male puberty, has testosterone, has a lot of effects on them, grows their body, deep voice, muscles, all that good stuff. Essentially what happens is like all the meaningful growth and differentiation that happens at this stage, like there's a lot that happens, but it's primarily caused by testosterone and exposure to it. And so the meaning, like the implication of that, like there's a lot of implications, but the most immediate is that, like, remember the conversation on hormone blockers from earlier? Well, if we're able to get trans people on hormone blockers before they go through the effects of puberty, especially like trans women, before they go through the effects of like a male puberty, then they won't get any of those disproportionate kinds of benefits, right? Like they'll just be none at the beginning. So like that's kind of like the first layer, is to recognize that like, so we're not actually talking about all trans women, because not all of them have experienced like the effects of testosterone-based puberty. So now we're shrinking so before we were starting with all trans people, then we're talking about all trans women, and now we're talking about all trans women that have gone through a male puberty. All right, so now we have to evaluate, all right, so do all trans women who have gone through a male puberty have an inherent immutable athletic advantage? The answer to that question is no, for several reasons. But the first and foremost being that, like, even giving that testosterone is largely responsible for meaningful athletic differences between different kinds of people, like even considering that, there still is a problem that like testosterone affects people idiosyncratically, meaning that it affects everyone differently. You'll see broad, I can't remember how to do this. you'll see broad trends and you'll see like large aggregate averages among people. But at the end of the day, you still will have people who, let's say, are like AMAT or assigned male at birth who go through a male puberty. Like you and I, like everyone has seen, you know, people who fit into like these situations, right? Absorb power. I'm trying to figure out exactly what this game is asking me to do right now. Can't figure it out. Oh wait, I think I got it. All right, got it. Cool. But yeah, so like, we all know that there are people who are like this, who like go through a testosterone-based puberty, and yet despite the fact that they go through a testosterone-based puberty, probably don't get as many benefits as we would consider other people to normally, right? Like you have people who, did I do it? Nice. Cool. I did it. So like, in those kind of situations where someone even someone who goes through like a male puberty and like, it experiences the effects of testosterone but doesn't experience them enough that it would give them a disproportionate advantage, we probably wouldn't want to exclude those people either, because of the fact that, you know, if the reason that we would want to like exclude those people from women's sports is because of the fact that they would have an inherent advantage, well, we don't want to exclude the people who don't have an inherent advantage even if they went through the effects of puberty. So we can cast out those people as well. So now, going back to the people we're trying to talk about who have an athletic advantage, we're talking about trans women who have gone through male puberty, who, as a consequence of going through male puberty, have an inherent who have acquired an athletic advantage over cis women. All right, that's the group that we're now talking about. Can those people get? So now the next question is, can those people get rid of those advantages? And the answer is, it depends. At least based on the literature, right? So there's some studies that have shown that trans women who go on to hormone replacement therapy for a sufficient amount of time may lose those inherent athletic advantages that they acquired in the course of hormone replacement therapy. 2 studies have been done, at least comprehensive studies have been done, at least to my knowledge. I'm pretty sure there's not more. I think I've read all the literature on this. Or I mean, like there are other like literature reviews, but like 2 specifically testing athletic advantage in particular. Right? Whereas there are other studies that will study like specifically like strength or different kinds of measures, right? But there are 2 on athletic advantage in particular. One which looks at distance running among 8 trans women, and one which was conducted by the Air Force at like a bunch of entering trans women in the Air Force. And what both the studies show is that over the course, so like the runner study showed that like over the course of 1 year, that like before and after having gone on HRT, that trans women performed comparably to the other genders with which they identified with before and after transition, right? So before transition, they ran at race times comparable to cis men, and afterwards they ran at race times comparable to cis women, which seems to suggest that HRT does at least have a high likelihood of getting rid of any possible athletic advantage in that respect, right? The other study, which was a bit more comprehensive, showed that I think it was conducted after, and it showed that like after 1 year, trans women who were tested on the aggregate still had a bit of an athletic advantage, but what the study said was essentially that there still was an overall decrease in athletic performance, and they would recommend that if we wanted to allow those trans women to be able to compete, then it's probably just necessary to be able to like it's probably just necessary to make sure that we are that we just have them on HRT longer, like some amount of time, maybe like it's 2 years, maybe it's 3 years, however long it takes to be able to like get rid of that inherent athletic advantage. And we know that there are trans women who have been able to get rid of it because like trans women have been competing in women's sports for a while now. There are plenty of examples of trans women competing in women's sports at the highly competitive level who have been competing up there but haven't like completely destroyed or demolished the competition. Like they've done fine, but haven't like nearly blown out the competition. So we know it's possible to be able to go on HRT and to like end up in a place where you don't have such an inherent athletic advantage that you're not like destroying all the competition, you know? So to recap, the people that we're talking about who may have an inherent advantage over cis women are trans women who have gone through male puberty, who as a consequence of male puberty did not acquire an inherent athletic advantage over cis women, and who, after having gone through HRT, have not lost their inherent athletic advantage over cis women, or who haven't gone through HRT whatsoever, right? Like if you haven't gone through HRT then and you still were conferred an athletic advantage, then you probably are going to retain it. Now we approach the question, do we want to litigate this small percentage of this small minority of people who are going to be competing in women's sports? And I'm going to be the one to make the judgment call here. Like, maybe you can have, like honestly, like, my honest opinion after, like, going through all of that, because we're talking about such a small percentage of people, I think it can be fair to have, like, a requirement. Like, I think that, like, the most best faith, like, application of this is that, like, it can be fair to have, like, a restriction on, like, how long you should be on HRT before, like, allowing trans women to compete in women's sports. Like, maybe it's like 2 years instead of 1, or maybe it's 3. But, like, you have to let them compete at some point, especially because, and the nail in the coffin on this is that, like, a lot of trans women, like, studies also show that excluding trans women from athletic competition and, like, disproportionately harming them in this way does also fundamentally contribute to, like, higher risk of suicide. Like, when people point out that, like, oh, trans people have a higher risk of suicide, this is the kind of social ostracization that kind of results in that. And to be frank about it, it's also, like, that lines up with my own personal experience. Because, like, I'm terrified to go to gyms. I'm terrified to participate in sports because, like, I'm terrified of being, like, ostracized by people when I get there. I'm terrified of how people will treat me. I feel like people are going to treat me like a freak. And it really sucks because, like, sports seem fun. I know sports seem fun because I used to do sports and I liked them, you know? But unfortunately, like, we live in a world where where this is, like, such a big issue that, like, it's basically, like, even if it's not, like, litigation, like, even if I'm not, like, legally prohibited from participating in sports, it's still really hard to and be able to enjoy it, you know? But so that's essentially the way that I would approach it. So, like, taking all that together, and I know that that was a lot, but I feel like it essentially gets us where we want to go. I feel like it's very, like, I feel like as a policy matter, we should try and do everything that we can to include trans women in women's sports, considering it's consistent with the gender that they identify with, considering that there's, like, and especially that there's, like, a large policy matter for allowing it, you know? Like, oh, hold on, let me figure out. Oh, I can heal myself? Oh, that's so fucking cool. Sorry. But considering that there's such, like, a large policy consideration that we should probably be inclusive, like, even, like, according to the Olympic Committee, I believe, they put out a statement, and I included in my research doc, that, like, you know, we should make every effort to include trans women in women's sports, or, you know, sports consistent with their gender identity. And, like, the reason why is because, like, you know, we want everyone to be able to enjoy these. And especially considering that, like, especially considering the fact that a lot of the worries or the concerns that people have about trans women, like, dominating in sports are evidentiarily unfounded, given, like, all the conversation that we've had so far about the fact that, like, we're not talking about all trans women. We're talking about, like, a small minority of trans women. We're talking about, like, a fraction of an already small and marginalized community, you know? Like, it seems like there's just an overwhelming, like, reason to the contrary that we should probably include them in sports. Or I say them, us. That was a very, 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 very long answer, but does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you laid out your points very well. Yeah, I mean, I definitely see where you're coming from, and I agree for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I think that, you know, you put it perfectly. I mean, it's such a small subset of the population that, you know, legislation might not necessarily be appropriate. Especially since one of the issues that I do run into with that at the same time is then you do have to come to a concrete definition. And I feel like, you know, that kind of goes back to the idea of, you know, then it can feel like you're literally trying to erase certain people's identities.
Sure.
So I guess then moving on, not, you know, trying to disregard your point, but I think it ties in well,
Okay.
is how would you, or I guess what do you think is the best way to that the average layperson should educate themselves, because it's going to be really hard to motivate people to go through research and findings and empirical analysis and
Yeah.
statistics and those sorts of things to have educated conversations. It's very easy to hear the conviction to the point where I feel generally pretty good about the fact that you know what you're talking about. I don't necessarily need to go through everything immediately and be like, oh,
Mhm.
you're completely wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like the average person doesn't necessarily have that same attitude or the same level of depth of knowledge that you would have. So then the
Mhm.
other person might feel the need to go do that, but not necessarily the motivation.
Yeah. So like this is ultimately an issue. I mean, like this is the reason why. I don't know. This is also the reason why. I mean, this ties back into a conversation that we had earlier, right? Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of these, like, this is a really sensitive subject to explore. Like it
Yeah.
is a really, really sensitive issue, and this especially because like the argument is like, in case it's not clear, like I think I put it as cleanly and concisely as possible. It is still super complicated, right? Like that is like an S tier level of difficulty as far as like as far as like arguments for trans rights goes, being able to put that all
Mm.
together. um but hey, and that's why you have ESO here, to be able to help you. But anyway, so the thing that I generally recommend in these kinds of circumstances is finding ways to be able to aggregate as much, like basically the really big task for a lot of people is talking to people who are educated on the subject and being able to create tools to be able to educate people in as straightforward and as well explained and as like a effective a way as possible, right? That's what I try to do with my research documents, is I try to lay out everything as clear and concise as possible so that basically like people can just take it and spread it across the world. All right. I want like my internal thought processes to spread like a plague and infect people's minds. But with a good, like with a good benefit, like for the betterment of people. And basically I would like it to get to the point where, and we're not talking, like, obviously I'm not like, you don't have to necessarily use the docs that I prepare, but just like being able to find ways to be able to just like think about an idea and really become comfortable and familiar with it to the point where you become like able to convey that idea easily to other people, you know? Um, a lot of, I think it's really important to recognize that like a lot of really complicated ideas that that historically like our society has had to grapple with um nowadays are probably recognized as like pretty simple concepts, like before, like imagine like the idea of money before it existed, right? And imagine like the way that the first person tried to describe money, you know like it's a really weird concept. It's completely socially constructed, and it's like a weird thing to grasp your mind around. Especially if you live in the world where before you're like barter and trade, we're largely, or maybe like gold standard or whatever. But then like someone tries to explain it at the beginning, it's probably like a very complicated concept to explain. But as people kind of like figure out how to refine it over and over, and as it becomes more normalized in society, eventually people kind of like are able to generally convey ideas like much easier. And so like, and maybe that's like an abstract example, but like here, I think that a lot of the work becomes just like learning as much about a thing as is possible, so that you can be able to convey it easier to other people who may not be as motivated to go out and learn for themselves, but can rely on you to convey to them information so that they can feel like at least reasonably informed on something. Like a good example is like professors in college, like you don't have to like study as much as a professor in a particular field to be able to learn from them, because like a good professor should be able to take a wide field of knowledge and condense it down into an understandable format where you can learn at least the broad trends within a field, or the broad like meaning or lessons from a field of study within a condensed amount of time, like you're essentially figuring out how to do that, but like on a more interpersonal level, right? Like in a way, like I kind of do, like in a way, like this is almost like a classroom setting where people are learning things as we are doing this, you know? And it's like a skill of figuring out how to most effectively teach people. How do you keep them engaged? How are we talking about things? How do we make sure that we're accurate and all that good stuff, right? Like, it's just like developing that skill or those skills and like spreading that knowledge as ethically as possible. That would be like my recommendation. I'm not sure if that's like operative or helpful. But as far as like the best advice I could give, that's probably like the best advice I could give. It's just like, even if other people aren't going to go out and learn, like it's better for you to learn and learn how to convey ideas easily so that when other people come to you or you have the opportunity to explain something, that you can make sure that you're like conveying good information that people can rely on and maybe they can spread as well. And even if they aren't able to spread it like to such a degree as you're able to, they'll still be able to spread at least like a decent concept. Like I learned a lot of political science stuffs from my political science professors. Do I know them as well as my professors did? Probably not, but I'm still able to convey a lot of that information to people, and I feel like I'm still able to convey like a decent amount, maybe not as much as they could if they were here instead of me, but like, you know, enough that other people are able to benefit, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, it seems like an easy ask anyway. The only See, I'm really bad at phrasing stuff like this because I don't want to use the word issue, but the roadblock that I see that could potentially run into is the fact that it seems like a repeat cycle in the fact that those people who were already apt to read your research would have without the well, I guess that's a bad way to put it though, but essentially there's a bias that those people who are already apt to read the research would do it with or without your motivation, and those that wouldn't, even with the motivation, wouldn't.
What do
Does
you
that
mean?
make sense?
I'm not sure if it does. Can you explain a little bit more?
Okay, yeah, for sure. So basically, you know, the masters that I'm working on is stats, and one big issue that we have to run into whenever it comes to research is the idea is that is your data inherently biased in the sense that you are sampling people that were naturally going to give you a certain result anyway. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to communicate is, do you think that there's already an issue with that because of the fact that those people are already willing to listen and willing to read the research and willing to have those conversations wouldn't have necessarily a negative impact or wouldn't inhibit change that would be beneficial?
What would be the thing inhibiting like change? Like
the person. So so let's say you have two people. One is already naturally open-minded to the idea of you know, a transgender person, their needs that are, you know, special or unique in society, the other isn't. And the idea is that one person is already going to be open-minded to that idea, therefore they are naturally more than likely not going to inhibit some change that would provide benefit to that certain community. Am I making more sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand like what you're trying to articulate. So what's the question then?
So basically, I see that idea of being able to communicate your ideas, while it is generally great, I also still see it running into that roadblock of, well, you know, you're still going to run into those people who would be the majority to try to block meaningful change that would benefit those communities. And so that tactic might not necessarily work in the same way as you intend.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So basically, like, people who, despite every best effort to be able to reach them, are just going to choose to not listen to you because they're inherently biased against whatever it is you're talking about to begin with. Like, some people, it doesn't matter how much I talk to them, no matter what I say, no matter how many ways I put it, 6 ways a Sunday, they're just going to be like, nope, trans women are men. I'm not going to allow them in the women's sports because they're men. And there's nothing that you can say to be able to change my mind on that. Is that kind of like what you're articulating?
Yeah, exactly. And like, for example, you know how a lot of people say that even though, you know, the left typically is a lot more vocal on political issues, the right typically votes more. You know, the whole idea is that there might be a smaller amount of those people, but because they're the ones trying to push against so hard, those are, you know, really the people that you should be trying to change, because those are the people that are going to actually, you know, and all this is under the hypothetical, I may or may not be right, but those are the people that are actively going to harm or try to take away some things that might benefit that community.
So basically, the way that I look at this as far as like strategy, right? Because I usually think in terms of like large scale, because I'm thinking in terms of like political advocacy, right? There's a couple things, right? The first is that, like, yes, there are some people who are going to be predisposed to agree with you from the onset. Recently, I discovered that this is something that's very true in my community because, you know, when I was so like the whole recent drama, What Makes a Woman, Debate with Demon Mama, all that, right? The essential take that I had given, which has come under like a lot of scrutiny and discussion recently, is not a take that I had not made before. In fact, it's been public knowledge. Like, I have had it in the research doc that I had published since the beginning of my research doc channel. Like, it has been public knowledge. People have known about it. Like, it's been my public stance for a long time, and I've used it multiple times. Now, I've said it before, but I think that the reason that people did not put it under the same scrutiny that it is coming under right now is because under every other previous circumstance, it had only ever come up in the context of debates or discussions against other people who explicitly were disliked by my community, right? Like, people who, it really didn't matter what I said necessarily, as long as to my community, I was basically like dunking on them or proving that they were wrong, right? So those were people where it's like, they didn't necessarily care so much probably about like the exact particulars of what I was saying, as long as it was reasonably conveyed to them that like, oh, you know, like Riley is totally dunking on this person who made me feel invalidated. That's awesome. I like that. And not necessarily the reason why I'm able to do that to begin with, you know? And the problem with that is that like, ultimately, if that same logic is ever applied against people who they do like more, then I might get a lot of pushback, like what I got recently. And so like, yes, there's definitely an issue where like, you know, people might agree with you regardless of the exact like methodology with which you push an idea or try to push for an outcome, as long as they just like agree vaguely with the type of outcome and not necessarily understand the full methodology with which you get there, right? So it's true for like a lot of people in like legislation, right? Like, legislative advocacy is hard and you have to do a lot of negotiating and whatnot, but like, you know, a lot of people won't necessarily like take issue with the ways that you achieve like legislative change as long as you're able to get the outcome that they want. But they'll take a big issue if you aren't able to get exactly what they want, or exactly or if you end up like doing certain things in the course of getting there that become public knowledge that people don't like, even if you are getting the outcome that they desire, right? And so that's definitely an issue. It's 100% an issue. There's not a great way to be able to deal with that, except like, I don't have a great answer. I'm literally trying to figure that out right now. So check back in with me on that one. As far as like people who are deliberately obtuse and won't listen to you no matter what you say, I would define those people generally as like unreasonable people, right? Reasonable people usually being like, you know, if you're able to make like a really good argument on something and you're able to like prove, like in the way that like I've talked to you, like you sound like a reasonable person insofar as like, you know, at every point in the conversation, you know, we've been able to follow pretty, you know, like I feel like we haven't really lost each other. I feel like the conversation has towed a good line. I feel like the back and forth has been like decent. You know, like I'm not necessarily worried, like you're kind of like the focused demographic for a lot of these arguments, but for people who no matter what I say, I won't be able to reach, I don't try to waste as much time on those people because there's like, even if I am able to reach them, the disproportionate amount of effort I would have to spend on them, I like for convincing that one person, I probably could have convinced like 10 or 100 other people who are more reasonable, you know? And so I try to focus on those people more with my advocacy and trying to target whatever the reasonable person is. And the idea is that like over long enough, if I do this for like a long enough amount of time, then eventually I will have more people on my side who have chosen to listen to me than the people who have chosen not to listen to me, who are deliberately on my side no matter what I say, you know? And then over enough time, you know, maybe eventually a push comes to shove and they start lashing out against like what eventually becomes the majority opinion, kind of in the way that like a lot of conservatives try to paint themselves today. Like they are always like, well, we're the minority, you know, like the left media is taking over. Well, I mean, like there's a reason why a lot of corporations, for example, are pro-LGBT, is because they don't necessarily care so much about LGBT people, but they know that like LGBT acceptance is high enough that they're able to profit from it, you know? That like it's a normalized enough idea in society that LGBT people should be accepted and supported, that they can be able to profit from LGBT acceptance, you know? And like now we're in a good position with LGBT advocacy because like even if there are people who no matter what you say will never support you or support, I say you, I'm talking like LGBT people, so I should probably say me. Even if there are people out there who will never support me, the majority of people do. And that's what's important, because now in Maryland, for example, the implication of that is that we're able to pass a bill getting rid of the trans panic defense and nobody testifies against it. Maybe not necessarily because there are people out there who, like there's no one out there who disagrees with it. There probably are people who disagree with it. But because they know that the majority opinion has changed so much that they can't reasonably expect to testify against it without being exposed as the giant bigots that they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that that is a good strategy potentially, and I also think that like you said, that there's a lot of energy that could be wasted on those people and that's a big issue that I've struggled with mentally for a couple of years, that I've been trying to work myself through, is whether or not there truly is just a point of no return, where no matter how educated you are, no matter how not rhetorical, like persuasive you are, you're never just going to convince the other person. That there's just a 0% chance, 0% hope, that kind of thing. Because I'm typically an optimist. I believe that most people, under the right circumstances, will concede to evidence.
Yeah.
But I've also had certain life experience that have shown me to the contrary, and my mind usually goes to, well, there is something wrong on my end. Maybe I wasn't educated enough. Maybe I didn't spell out my argument well enough. Maybe I didn't show enough evidence,
You and I
et
think
cetera, et
very
cetera. So
similarly,
that's
man.
one of those.
I usually
Yeah,
think like the same, right? Like I'm always like, God, what possible string of words could I put together to be able to convince the other person, right?
exactly.
Yeah, it's just important to recognize that like sometimes you can do the absolute best that's possible. Sometimes you just have to acknowledge that it's not you, it's the other person, right? Like
For
ultimately,
sure.
and it's good to not think that often. It's good to be like very self-critical, because oftentimes if you think that about everyone, then you fall into the risk of like becoming intellectually lazy and just hand waving away any meaningful criticism or challenging to your thoughts as just like, oh, they're just being unreasonable. They won't listen to logic and reason, right? So it's good to not think that all the time, but it's good. But like, it is important to recognize also to the contrary that like, there will be just people who never listen to you despite your best efforts. Figuring out exactly who is and who isn't reasonable it's a hard thing to do, but like eventually you start, like as you learn more and as you educate yourself more, eventually like as you get more knowledge into your noggin, like you'll naturally be able to pick up more, right? Because like essentially if you're able to sufficiently rebut every argument someone gives, and they just choose to be deliberately obtuse at the end of it, then they probably weren't acting in good faith to begin with, and those are people who you won't be able to reach, So,
For sure.
yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk with me and giving me some insight on our conversation. I think a lot of that can be acted upon, so I really appreciate that. But I don't want to take up too much time. I know a lot of other people want to talk to you.
Hey, yeah, no, it's all good. I'm enjoying the conversation. I enjoyed the conversation a ton. I felt like it was super. I feel like people. I don't know. I hope people learned from it. I wasn't paying attention to chat, so I apologize, chat. Please forgive me. But yeah, I thought that was super. Yeah, I thought that was good. So all right. Have a good day. All right.
You as well. Bye bye.
Bye.